Give me just 1 minute.
Yeah, no worries. I'm gonna go through some housekeeping items before I hand it over to you, Samantha. Alrighty, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we start, I do want to go over a few things. So as you know, this presentation will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel in spotlight mode, meaning that only our speaker will be visually recorded. And also for audio, if you do ask a question, that will be a part of the recording as well. So if you're not quite comfortable with displaying your name or being on video, please feel free to turn your video off. And we will leave room at the end for questions. And in the meantime, you can definitely always feel free to drop questions in the chat and we will get to them at the end. Before we delve into today's discussion, I'd like to take the time to acknowledge that Bluebonnet Data is an organization of individuals residing on the traditional homelands of the people of Munsee Lenape, Pawtucket, Massachusetts, Kikaipoy, Humanos, Tawakani, Wichita, Lipuan Pachi, and Chickasaw nations. And our speaker today resides on the homelands of Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi nations, as well as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sauk, and Meskwaki, Kikaipoy, and Ilaini nations. As a remotely based organization with employees and partners who are geographically scattered across these lands, we acknowledge that Native and Indigenous peoples are the rightful stewards of the lands that we reside on, and that there's a deep-rooted and continuous relationship between them and their territories. We acknowledge our history of colonization and genocide of Native and Indigenous people and their lands, and the cities that we reside in are home to over 436,481 American Indians today. So with that being said, I'll start by introducing myself and our guest. I'm Christina Hahn, the comms director at Bluebonnet Data. And if you aren't familiar with Bluebonnet, we are a political nonprofit focused on recruiting and matching data talent and tech talent to down ballot progressive campaigns through a fellowship program. Today, we have the honor of hosting Samantha Boucher, who will be speaking on the topic of digital organizing, the new secret weapon of progressive campaigns. Samantha is a technologist, trans activist, and former federal campaign manager. In 2018, she became the first openly trans person to manage a federal campaign and went on to serve as campaign manager and staff for U.S. Senate and U.S. congressional campaigns in the following cycles. And just 2 weeks ago, her startup, Shire, recently won Netroots Conference's pitch competition in the category of Best New Tool. A technologist by trade and serial startup early hire, she helped to grow multiple startups and now serves as the founder of Shire. Without further ado, I would love to hand this off to our speaker, Samantha.
Thank you. I am so glad to be here with you guys. And thank you for those of you who may have signed up for last week, but got pushed off to today. I was still traveling after the conference, and I don't know, something about being in front of that many people in person was pretty exhausting. So I'm very grateful for Bluebonnet for having me, and hopefully you guys get something useful out of this. So let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to keep my camera off just because my computer is not a huge fan of video recording and screen sharing at the same time for some reason. So give me just one moment. Okay. And can you see my screen with the presentation? Wonderful. Okay, so as Christina mentioned in her intro, so we're going to talk about the new secret weapon of progressive campaigns, which is digital operations. So a little bit of background. As Christina mentioned, I am, although I'm not sure why this slide is super blurry. I'm a technologist by trade, and have been in the progressive fight for a number of years, both in local LGBT community organizing, as well as in the political arena with time spent with brand new Congress and various candidates, serving as campaign manager and in other roles. So what's all this about? So in this lecture, we're going to cover a couple things. So first, just going over some definitions and fundamentals. So what is digital organizing, distributed organizing, digital operations? The terms get a little bit scrambled for a lot of people, and there is a lot of overlap and a lot of different ways of doing this. So I want to cover kind of how I see that and what I think the paradigm is at current. We'll also go over the recent history of organizing. So what was the evolution of distributed and digital organizing? And then finally, diving into what's wrong with the current model. So there are a bunch of gaps that we'll talk about, and the COVID pandemic really exacerbated a lot of those. But they were always there. We just didn't see them as clearly. We'll also discuss progressive digital infrastructure. In my note here, I say it might not make the evening news like a bridge collapse, but it's losing its elections. And it's an ongoing challenge that hopefully those of you in the technology space and working with Bluebonnet can help with in the future. And then we'll close out with why we believe digital operations is the next evolution in digital organizing. So some definitions and fundamentals. So there are a few different terms that we've talked about here. So generally in campaigns, campaigns are all organized around a central idea that voter contact, that is to say, actually reaching voters in different ways, be that knocking on doors, making phone calls, TV ads, print ads, mail, etc. Voter contact influences voters to turn out in elections and sometimes can persuade them to support your candidate or cause in the case of a ballot initiative or an organization. Typically and traditionally, honestly, since the time of Abraham Lincoln, I believe he wrote the original quote about how to do field organizing back in the 1850s Illinois state senate elections that he was in. So there's some fun background, but it's been around for a very long time. The concept is pretty much find out who your voters are and go talk to them. That simple, right? But it gets really complicated in this modern era, especially in the age of the digital tools. And unfortunately, everything with a physical component, whether that's setting up a field office or doing community-centric actions and direct voter contact, is kind of limited by the organizing potential that you have as a campaign. So how much money you have, how many volunteer leaders you've managed to recruit, et cetera. So on the digital side, the lines get pretty fuzzy, and that's why I've put digital in quotes, because as any digital organizer will tell you, they're often asked to do and called to do many things that are not necessarily in the role of a traditional like social media manager that you could easily transplant from, say, the corporate world or business world. They're often running digital ads, they're managing social media, but beyond that, they're often also organizing in online spaces, forums, Twitter DM threads are common ways to do this, Reddit, things like that, and a variety of other tasks and tooling as well. And so there's actually a lot of overlap with the operations side of the house because there is voter contact that's happening as well. Now, distributed is kind of the new kid on the block. It often gets lumped under field operations as far as the division or who's responsible for it, but it's more digital in nature. So distributed organizing is best thought of as a hub and spoke organizing model. The idea there is getting your organizers to recruit smaller teams of volunteers in a more distributed way and getting those volunteers trained as leaders so that they can do the same. Finally, digital operations, as we see it, is a new paradigm because it combines elements that are traditionally relegated to those other spaces and brings them under a single umbrella. So you can think of this like the Space Force approach of branches. You had a variety of different space-related tasks under a bunch of different military and government branches, and then there was an effort to consolidate them under a single umbrella in order to make them more efficient and effective. So as I mentioned, they're sort of the same, but there's overlap, and it's really important that we distinguish what that overlap is because as I mentioned, the current model of doing kind of field and digital and then distributed gets thrown in there by some campaigns works sometimes. But at this point, the kind of the scale and the needs have evolved to the point that we need to consider digital operations, in my opinion, an entirely separate department on a campaign. It needs to have its own resources, its own infrastructure, and its own mandate. So a recent history of campaign organizing and how digital and distributed organizing has evolved. So all the way back in 2012, the Obama campaign ran probably one of the most effective and well-known modern social media campaigns in history. They really set the standard for what social media could be used for, and how it should be done to organize people across the youth vote, as well as, because Facebook in particular, it has such a high penetration amongst older voters. It's close to 80 or 90%, even in people over 65. They really absolutely killed it. I'm not sure who made this image and misspelled Barack Obama's name, but that's kind of funny to me. Anyway, so obviously that had a huge impact on Obama's victory in 2012. But their program, voter contact, was still really rooted in this concept of field operations. They did begin to explore a distributed organizing model, but the way that they did that was through paid staff and field offices. So they would set up field offices around the country in a variety of places, and their local staff would recruit local volunteers. And that may seem kind of obvious to us today as a tactic that a campaign might use, but it was pretty innovative for its time, and in the scale and depth at which they actually pushed that out. So the key difference here, and what really made the Obama campaign so much more successful than the Republican Party in this era, was simply who was actually doing the social media organizing, right? So with the Romney campaign, it was very top down, very centrally controlled. Whereas with the Obama campaign, they really relied a lot on people and the supporters of the campaign to actually get that message out there. And sure, they were driving the messaging, but it was the people that were supporting the campaign that were the diehards that were actually pushing things forward there. So into 2016 and 2018, so the Bernie Sanders campaign really, in my opinion, pioneered the distributed organizing model far more effectively than any campaign had done before. They still had a heavy emphasis on physical distributed organizing, but they really empowered, and this is the difference between the Obama and Bernie campaigns from 2012 to 2016, they really empowered volunteers to actually take leadership positions and roles, and gave them authority and power in their respective sort of areas, right? And so that, as we mentioned on the social side, was incredibly effective on social media, and they were able to replicate that effectiveness in their distributed organizing model physically. Now, Beto also did an incredible job of this in 2018 with his Senate race. I remember taking notes from his staff back in 2018, because what they did was a similar method, but even stronger than the Bernie team. They even opened offices that didn't have any paid staff at all, or any paid organizers. They would actually allow volunteers to open what they called pop-up offices, and they would deliver them with campaign materials, and they had really well-structured published guides so that volunteers could actually open their own Beto offices all over the place. They published a map that kind of, revealed the locations. So if you were, and that was everything from, a volunteer team setting up an office like what you see on the screen, where they actually like rented out a space and did a whole field operation out of that local location, but all the way down to just a tent on the side of the road. I mean, that was the level of sort of depth that the Beto campaign was able to do. But again, this was a very physical idea. Now, one of the things that came out of the Bernie campaign in 2016 and really evolved into 2018 were the peer-to-peer texting and remote phone banking operations. So there were tools like that were actually developed on the Bernie 2016 campaign, like Spoke, like Through Talk. Tools like this have been used with great success since, and in that time, of course, to enable people to, do massive phone banks and texting operations, sometimes even remotely. Now, in 2020, I'm not sure why the images didn't change, but forgive me. In 2020, the Bernie campaign and its affiliated sort of progressive landscape and networks, folks like the Sunrise Movement, et cetera, really took this to an absolutely new extreme. So drawing on the lessons of the 2016 campaign, as well as the midterms, they actually created the first truly distributed digital operations model with its own standalone mandate and its own standalone department. And that was incredible because they actually were able to get over 70,000 people to volunteer digitally at varying degrees. A lot of other campaigns and organizations in the space followed suit and to varying degrees of success. One of the challenges, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, is the infrastructure that they had to build to get there. So a lot of folks don't know this, but the Bernie campaign actually was working on a mobile app and their own kind of in-house builds for a long time in the early months of the campaign, which they had to scrap because it's a big resource suck to be standing up a whole team of developers and trying to organize around that. It's very difficult for a campaign to do, even a campaign as well resourced as the Bernie campaign. And so that leads us to this thought that the current model just isn't enough. And digital operations needs to be more aggressively adopted by campaigns across the board as an organizing model. So what's good about field, right? So with field operations, we know that in-person voter contact is the best method to turn out people, and that in-person volunteer offices foster community and volunteer engagement like nothing else. So that's fantastic, and that's absolutely never going to go away. It's very important, but it has some flaws. So it's limited by geography. If you're not in the area that the campaign is operating, then you can't really participate in the same way. And also, if you have accessibility issues, it can be very difficult to volunteer in person. And for me, I have long COVID, and I know a lot of people are suffering with that these days, and more as the pandemic kind of wears on. And I can't knock doors like I used to be able to, not in the same way. And so, that drove it home for me. But this has always been accessibility has always been a passion of mine. And I think as progressives, we talk a really good game about accessibility, but actually don't really roll out the carpet, so to speak, for folks and make sure that they have access to participate in these processes. The other thing is that typically in campaigns, especially Senate, congressional, and smaller, field operations is used as a catch-all for anything related to voter contact. You'll have departments like finance, you'll have departments like, you'll usually have a small admin department, you'll have communications or digital, and then field operations just kind of gets everything else. And in my opinion, and in my experience, that actually distracts your field director and the staff that are trying to run an on-the-ground field operation, because they're stuck managing not just the physical on-the-ground component, which is, as we've established, the most effective method of voter contact and therefore one of the most important. But they also have to manage this new sort of distributed model and oftentimes even digital programs. And so it becomes decidedly less effective. Whereas if you can separate those and have field really truly focusing on physical on the ground door knocking and community canvassing events, then you're going to get a lot more effectiveness out of those. Everything comes back to what we call in campaign management and organizing the win number. So at the beginning of a race, you sit down and you look at past election trends in that area, and you take a look at basically how many votes do you need to get to win, right? And the typical approach is looking at 55%, and that's the target that you go for. And thanks to political scientists and decades of research and work, we actually have a really good idea of the numerical statistics and probabilities of all of these different voter contact methods. Everything from knocking on a door to volunteer hours to every little thing has a quantifiable number. And you can sit down for any district in the country and do the math and figure out, what does this campaign need to have to win? And there's two levers you can pull as a campaign manager. One of those levers is fundraising. So you can either increase the number of dollars you're bringing in that you can use to pay for different types of voter contact methods at various levels of effectiveness. And the other method is, or the other lever you can pull is volunteer hours. So especially for grassroots campaigns that are limited in their ability to fundraise massive amounts of money, it can be really important and so much more important, in fact, to have volunteer hours as the lever that gets pulled, because that really is what will drive those campaigns over the top. The other thing is that for campaigns in really hotly contested and very, very close races, looking at folks like Raphael Warnock in Georgia, even John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, although I think the latest polls have him up quite a bit. It's really critical that those campaigns get as much volunteer energy as they can, because they're going to raise what they're going to raise, and they're going to use that for certain types of methods. But At the end of the day, having a person knocking on a door is ultimately the most effective method that you can use. So digital. So the benefits of digital are it's one to many. You don't need a lot of people to run a digital operation, and reach can really be huge. The Obama campaign demonstrated how a very small team of digital organizers at the core can organize literally tens or hundreds of thousands of other people to make content and distribute that content, and to use a centrally defined message to get out there and organize other people and spread that information. And because of the sort of web structure of social media and the way that it works, that is truly the most effective strategy. But digital does have some drawbacks. So especially for campaigns that are at a state or district level, like a Senate campaign or a congressional campaign, digital actually has a lack of geography, which is kind of the opposite problem of what field has. Because if you're on Twitter, you're on Facebook, you're on social media, you're really getting the whole country there. And it can actually be very difficult with organic social media organizing to effectively target the actual voters in your district. So digital organizing is limited in that sense, in that the tools that are used are sort of, megaphones as opposed to scalpels, to mix metaphors. And it's also poorly defined in most campaigns. So there's, traditional media communications is typically what that department's been called for decades. But increasingly we're calling it digital, and then sometimes there's like overlap between the different departments and like what they're actually doing. So it can actually be unclear who's responsible for building and maintaining the infrastructure, especially which aspects of the program that each department is responsible for maintaining. So distributed organizing, as we talked about, is a really great model because you can have a limited number of paid organizers or core organizers and recruit additional either paid or volunteer organizers to manage and recruit additional volunteers. And in military and in emergency management circles, we call the number of people that one person can effectively manage the span of control. And we have over a century of research that points to the fact that the effective span of control for in-person organizing at a time, basically how many people can you lead at once, is somewhere between 7 and 10. And that plays out in organizations as well, even in a corporate model, or even in an organizing model. Really 7 to 10 is sort of the maximum that you can reasonably manage effectively. And so by creating this hub and spoke model, what the campaigns that have used this effectively have been able to do is create smaller, tight-knit teams of volunteers that actually know each other. So that increases the not only the ability of those organizers to operate, but also builds real relationships. And that's very important, because one of the biggest reasons that volunteers leave organizations, according to the Corporation for National and Community Service, onto research that they did, is because oftentimes volunteer organizations feel impersonal, especially at scale. They feel like they're a number, or they feel like they're not really making a significant contribution, or can't really see that contribution. And especially in the digital arena, where you're trying to organize people online, that breaks down even worse, because again, as we've established with the pandemic and plenty of folks doing work from home, it can be challenging, especially if the infrastructure isn't there. But fundamentally, distributed organizing is difficult to implement at scale, because political campaigns will go from, maybe if we're talking like a congressional campaign, a few dozen volunteers, to hundreds or even thousands in a matter of weeks. People tend to start focusing on elections a lot more at the last minute. And so the last month or two of a campaign is often the most heavily volunteer heavy in the entire cycle. And so what happens is the system of this sort of nature kind of breaks down if they didn't create the structures and infrastructure to support it. And they tend to revert to a more one-to-many model, which kind of takes us back to those old ways. And so I want to pause to offer just a minute of discussion on this. So I'm curious to hear from folks in the room, what are some experiences that you've had if you've volunteered on campaigns before, with these distinctions, and what are some of the challenges that you saw, if anything? that you think are interesting to talk about. Might throw you on the on the altar first, Christina, if you have any thoughts. Since I don't want to put any of our guests.
I like the consistent theme of mixed metaphors. I was thinking maybe under the bus, but on the altar. All right, sacrificial lamb.
I'm terrible. It's funny. People, even my colleagues laugh at me because I can't hold a metaphor to save my life.
I think what you were talking about with digital organizing as a whole, it was just so interesting because I put it in a comment in the chat. But yeah, 2012 Obama campaign, they pioneered something, and then the Republicans unfortunately learned from that. And so in 2016, the amount of money that he spent on Facebook reaching people where they are versus the more legitimate traditional media sources, that was like a big thing that we noticed from our side as well. And we've like talked about it a bunch. But yeah, in terms of specific campaign experience, I don't have a lot to say on that. Popcorning it to Becca, any thoughts and experiences?
One observation, and am I coming through okay? There's like a fan blowing on the computer. Okay. One observation, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on it, Samantha, is when I worked with the campaign in 2019, I noticed with technology and like whatever they were using it for, whether it was for their dashboards, for their volunteer mobilizing, if it didn't work the first time they tried it, then they had to totally abandon it because they were like, we don't have time to waste on like refreshing pages. And so it seemed like some volunteers were coming in with some really great ideas about like, oh, we could use this and this and this, and then it would just kind of like be thrown out and replaced with paper if it didn't like immediately catch hold. So I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I think there's two aspects to that, right? So one is that when things get stressful, people's natural inclination is to resort to authoritarianism. And no, I'm serious. I know, Christina, you're laughing, but it's the truth. When you're in a very stressful situation or you feel overwhelmed, oftentimes the go-to human reaction is to become authoritarian and to hold to retract trust, to hold cards closer to your chest, and that causes a lot of those models to break down, right? So what you're talking about with volunteers coming in with great ideas and kind of not being able to implement them effectively, that is because the campaign culture that was established probably did not make those volunteers feel empowered to make independent, autonomous decisions and take leadership in their own arenas. So this is why distributed organizing models can be really effective if the campaign is willing to trust the volunteers that they bring in to become those leaders, right? Because if you empower a local group or even an online group with the authority or the perceived authority to actually act, right? You don't necessarily need to adopt that tool or that process for the whole campaign. You can let them do it. And if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, it doesn't, right? And to some extent, that is actually more valuable than a centrally dictated approach, because what works in, I harp on this all the time, what works in West Virginia is not going to work in Florida and vice versa. And a lot of the times we try to nationalize these campaign tactics and approaches, and consultants will often roll out the same playbooks and kind of put those things in front of people and say, like, this is how it must be done. There's something of a notorious reaction from organizers in the South, particularly with folks coming from out of the region and sort of offering tactics, advice, tools, et cetera, that the locals know will not work in that area for various reasons. And so that conflict can be a challenge. On the other hand, honestly, it is a especially, pre-2020, and even now, and in a lot of ways, we're building a lot of this tech as we're flying it. It is, the tools like Spoke and Through Talk and things like that, we're duct taped together in 2016 and 2017, et cetera, to run those campaigns on the spot because they recognize the need, and that's kind of how the innovation happened. But it's taken time for, for the kind of tech organizing in the progressive movement to figure itself out. It's really kind of a new phenomenon, and a lot of the companies that are coming out and building new things, there's a lot of challenges that I can kind of talk about there. But tools break, it happens, and the best thing that we can do to make sure that the experience is the best it can be for most people is, in my opinion, decentralization. I think that it's a lot harder to mess up a phone bank with 150 people on it if the tools that you're using are not going to have 150 people on it in the first place. Like, you shouldn't be running phone banks that big. You shouldn't be doing, operating at that scale. You should be having teams of 10 or 15 people in a smaller group taking actions. And then if something breaks or something goes wrong, then the potentially the impact of that is not felt across the entire organization, and your operational capacity is not as heavily impacted by it. So yeah, so this is actually a really great segue to my next point, which is that our tech infrastructure right now is this bad. I mean, it's rough. We are, one of my favorite quotes that horrified me from the 2020 cycle is Dan Woods, who was the chief technical officer of the Biden 2020 campaign. In his post-campaign kind of analysis, described the work that they did to solve these challenges as digital duct tape. And the Biden campaign is famous for being the most well-funded campaign in American history. They had literally the most money in American history. So when their tech people are saying this was duct tape, then that to me reflects that we have a more fundamental problem in our in the way that we're doing digital and tech infrastructure for campaigns. Now, part of the challenge with that is that campaigns that have done this effectively are often the most well-resourced campaigns. And that's because they have to build a lot of these tools and a lot of these infrastructures from scratch, bringing a bunch of tools together, deciding which ones they're going to use, and trying to make them talk to each other in a way they're not designed to. The other thing is, excuse me, so calling back to the over 70,000 digital volunteers that Bernie Sanders had in 2020, one of the biggest problems that they ran into was communicating. So they used Slack, which everyone is at least somewhat familiar with, probably, if you're watching this this video, especially if you're on the tech side of the house. And you might say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, it is fundamentally a platform that is designed for business. It is not designed for volunteers, and it's not designed to operate at the kind of scales that we're operating at here, right? You get 72,000 people in a single Slack, and things kind of break, right? Not only that, but it's expensive. It's, again, designed for business. So if the Bernie Sanders campaign had paid for Slack for pro or even at a discounted rate, it would have cost them over $500,000 a month just for Slack alone for that many users. And that is obviously entirely untenable for even a large presidential campaign. I mean, that's a lot of TV, that's a lot of payroll, right? You can't be spending that on a single digital tool. And because of the way that the FEC is structured and the fact that campaigns are not, nonprofits as such, most of the laws that are in place to govern how tools can be sold to campaigns and PACs actually require vendors to sell them to those campaigns at fair market value. And that is a very murky and difficult to navigate legal subject. And so a lot of vendors just don't bother trying to establish a different pricing model for campaigns specifically. There's just not enough money in it, or it's too legally complicated, or there may be like investor risks, things like that. So for a lot of reasons, that tech infrastructure has really kind of been very slow to keep up with the pace of modern technical development. So just to like dive into digital operations a little bit. So as I mentioned, I think that fundamentally the difference between digital operations and something like distributed organizing is that digital operations is the idea of having a specific mandate for a department within a campaign. And it doesn't have to be a large campaign, even small campaigns can do this. But the idea is that people can volunteer from anywhere. It doesn't matter if they're not in the district or if they're not in person. It doesn't matter if they have an accessibility issue. It doesn't matter if they're sitting in rural Wyoming or downtown Manhattan. They can actually volunteer for campaigns and organizations that are important to them. And the problem right now is the infrastructure just doesn't support this. If you go to, which I think everyone would agree that some of these races are the most critical in the country right now. If you go to Raphael Warnock's volunteer page to try to sign up online, or you go to John Fetterman's, in fact, I'd encourage you guys, go there and try it. Try to sign up to volunteer and experience what happens. Because what you're going to see is you hit a brick wall. You put in your information. You say, yeah, I'd love to text. I'd love to make phone calls. And then what happens is you get a little message that says, thanks, we'll be in touch soon, right? And then the next steps are murky. It's not clear what's going to happen. They might reach out to you, maybe, if the campaign has the resources to do that, right? It's the problem of centralization, and there's not really a way that volunteers can help solve that problem because it's really an infrastructure challenge, right? So the way that we are at Shire building a tool to solve this from an infrastructure perspective is really building what we're calling the first digital office for progressive campaigns and organizations. So this really has three sort of spokes to it, or three main kind of verticals. So first is that onboarding that we talked about. So to get, if you're from a tech background, then you know how significant even an additional form step can be on drop off when someone's signing up for a new tool or a piece of software. So really onboarding and signing up needs to be as easy as starting a social media account. There shouldn't be, you shouldn't have to wait for an email or a phone call and then get on a Zoom call and then like go through 15 different steps to set up 5 different accounts, right? It really needs to be much more frictionless. Then Slack and tools like it are incredibly overwhelming to people that are less tech savvy, and they don't scale very well for volunteer operations. The other thing is that they, again, tend to default to that one-to-many approach and make it really difficult and impersonal and hard to maintain that span of control. So that's another problem that needs to be solved. And then finally, as I mentioned, if you're a volunteer coming in, you may need 5 different tools that you've never touched before in order to be effective or to volunteer for a campaign. And that can be very difficult. So what we're doing is bringing all of that together and making it possible through account provisioning and single sign-on to actually remove that friction too. So, with an onboarding like this, you can, enter your information and then go straight into the application. With chat, it's actually designed for volunteer-heavy organization that feels more like a social media experience from a UI UX perspective. It's possible to get folks that are not experienced with things like Slack in a more comfortable setting. And then obviously there's a lot more that we can do and will do. For example, building learning management modules so that folks can take training and do that in a decentralized way. And also one of the things that's really powerful about this is that it is this concept of digital operations is really about building that community fundamentally. Yeah, I think that I saw a question here in the chat already, but I think we're probably around the time that we want to pause for questions anyway. So do we have any other questions? I can go ahead and start answering those unless you have something else, Christina.
Nope, we can go ahead and look at the question here in the chat.
Yeah. So do you want to speak out loud, Sam, for the recording, or do you just want me to? I can respond in as such to your text either way. Cool. So Sam asks, so not campaigning focused, but distributed organizing, like you mentioned, reflects scaled planning seen in a lot of product development. the parallel ideology to create the actual product as development operations and DevOps models. What is the intersect or intentional overlap of those principles versus the cross-pollination of minds in spaces like Shire and Bluebonnet? Do you see these growing closer? What other influences might be changing campaign operating models? Yeah, that's a really great point. So my my tech background, day job, is as a product manager. So I absolutely know what you're talking about there. So I think that part of the challenge, and in fact, I spoke with some of your colleagues, Christina, at the Netroots Nation conference a few weeks ago about this, as well as a number of other vendors, is that we're not actually very good at coordinating with each other right now. And part of that is part of the same problem that volunteers and campaigns are having, right? We don't really have necessarily a common shared space or framework on which to build from. Really, in a lot of cases for technology and especially for tech companies, Slack has been the glue that holds all of their tools and organizing elements together for corporate environments, for business environments, right? You're plugging everything into your Slack, your support tools, your development tools. You know, people are like throwing Zapier integrations in there and then doing all sorts of like extra things. But we don't really have anything like that right now for political tech or for political organizing. And there have been efforts to create communities. But my personal belief on where those have not been able to scale as effectively is just because they're not really based around a fundamental tool set, right? They're based around, you know, there's an effort required to organize those, and there's not like a natural foundational you know, operating system to build on or to work with, right? And so with Shire in the future, what we're going to be doing is actually, we have this philosophy of ecosystem first. So we're actually going to take a very similar approach to what the Mozilla Foundation has taken, where in addition to having a company, because we have to have a company to, you know, to make the FEC happy and make sure that we can actually get the tool for the campaigns that we want to have it and not to, you know, random Republicans, for example. But we're going to create an organization like the Mozilla Foundation and actually work to build an open source and community-driven developer ecosystem. You know, I've had a bunch of engineers and developers from my own network and from you know, just out there in the world approach me and say like, hey, how can I volunteer to help with these things? And oftentimes the answer is, well, you can't, sort of, kind of. Here's some like organizations that do that, but they're, you know, they're over here and they're over there, right? So there's not really a central kind of rallying point, I think, for the cross-pollination of ideas and concepts. NGP-VAN is probably the most fundamental and ubiquitous piece of technology in all of political organizing. But because it deals with voter data and because it is a really sort of, what's the word I want to use? They have a tendency to be a bit more corporate in their thinking and in their sort of operational principles. It can be sort of a bit of a walled garden, and it's difficult for them to be that kind of glue that brings that sort of a community development ecosystem together. So we're hoping that Shire can become one of those foundations that people can not only integrate with but build on top of. We've been building, some of you tech folks will appreciate this, we've been building using web components in a very modular way for our front end and using micro front ends. And so what that means is that we're actually going to be able to allow other vendors and tinkerers to actually deploy their own modules into Shire. So it can become like a true operating system digitally for campaigns and organizations to use. Hopefully that is, one other thing related to Bluebonnet and the cross-pollination is that I think that training is one of the most interesting things that we can do on top of Shire. So we're going to actually offer a training marketplace where vendors and training specialists, like folks at Bluebonnet, Generation Data, and others, can actually build their own trainings and offer those to campaigns as plug and play out of the box deployable training systems. So, you know, if you're a campaign manager, you're like, oh, I need a texting training, I need this and that, right? You don't have to go build that from scratch yourself again. You can take the vendors that they provided for you and then add your own flair or repurpose it for your use, right? So that's another way that we can actually kind of change the model, is just by providing those tools in a more centralized way. And it all comes back to the volunteer experience and good UI UX planning. Anna has a question. So curious about different business development models for tools like Shire. They say, I feel like I hear a lot of debate about nonpartisan tools versus partisan tools and for-profit versus nonprofit, and wondering how those factors influence what gets built and who has access to these tools. I think that kind of segues into some of what I was talking about before, but in my opinion, there are a few big challenges facing folks like myself. So we are registered as a C Corp. And the reason for that is because if we were registered as a nonprofit, for example, there are significant restrictions on how we can operate with regards to campaigns and PACs. There are a lot of regulations that the FEC has in place and that the IRS has in place that really dictate how, who, and what you can sell to. And so it is C Corps partially because our government has like so massively deregulated corporations are the most flexible entity that you can have. And so that while it's, fundamentally sort of like antithetical to our values, we don't have to operate like a typical C Corp. So in our case, for example, we're taking donations, which is something that a C Corp typically wouldn't do, but legally is allowed to, fun fact. And it's not tax deductible, but we have a donations model where we're reaching out to political donors just like a PAC would and asking them to pitch in and help support operations, which is good because we haven't had any equity investment yet. And part of the reason for that is because the traditional venture capital models don't really work here for a couple of reasons. One, they are more often than not necessarily politically aligned with the values of progressive movements. Two, if they are capital firms that are made up of a variety of different investors that they're managing the fund for, what ends up happening is that they're afraid to invest in political technology that has a partisan bent or an ideological bent because there is a controversial or a potential for a blowback on them, right? And then I think the third is that there is a very limited set sort of investment from the Democratic Party itself in developing new technologies and tools. In my view, I think that the Democratic Party should set aside a significant amount of budget to create investment funds and things like that so that we can kind of build on some of these innovative technologies. In Shire's case, I work a full-time day job in addition to my full-time job as like founder and CEO of Shire. My co-founder also works, and our CTO also works a full-time day job in addition to his full-time CTO and development role at Shire. And our engineering director also works a full-time day job in addition to being a full-time engineer. So, we're organizers at heart, right? And so like, that's the kind of thing that we would be doing with our lives anyway. But part of the reason for that is because we have had some difficulty in getting capital investment. And that's not because we don't have good technology or because we don't have the experience we need to build things. It's just because it's not necessarily available beyond a few providers. And if you go outside of the political innovation kind of accelerator space, there just aren't a lot of firms that are willing to really entertain political tools. So, it's a tricky space to be in, especially as a first-time founder. And it's something that we, have consistently had challenges with, but, we're pushing through it and we're pretty close to a release actually for MVP and we're shooting for September here. The other thing that we're turning to is, fortunately, something the Obama administration did that was actually really helpful is something called Regulation CF. So it's basically equity crowdfunding, where anybody can invest as little as $100 through a website like WeFunder into your company and actually ultimately hold a piece of it. So we're actually really fond of that because there's been sort of a trend of political or consolidation in political tech and acquisitions. And I think that because of how small the ecosystem is I think that actually is stifling innovation to some extent. Because there is an economic pressure for founders that do end up getting venture capital investment to have an exit, to sell, to get acquired. They're trying to they're being pressured to pay back those investments. So we're hoping that by approaching this from a worker-owned and movement-owned approach, that we can avoid some of those pitfalls. We're still going to take institutional investment if it comes our way, but we're going to be very picky and selective about how we do that and what the terms are, even if it means short-term, less momentum in the short term. We think that that's really the better recipe for building a long-term sustainable community and business. So, any other questions?
If that's a no, then thank you so much. Samantha, what is the best way for any of us to contact you if we want to learn more about the work you do or about Shire?
Yeah, so I'm ready for that question. So you can go to getshare.com. We've got intercom because of course we do. So you can send me a chat message, and I'm happy to reply. And also just grab this QR code off your screen, and that'll take you to the website as well. You can also email me at samantha@getshare.com if you prefer email. And I will, in the description of this video, wherever it lands, provide hopefully links to do those things as well. The other thing I want to mention is, again, we are doing that equity crowdfunding campaign, and right now I think we're at about $30,000 invested there. The minimum floor is $50K, so we need to get to that mark by about September 15th. So if you're listening to this now or later, and you feel like even pitching in $100 or whatever you can, every little bit helps us get to that goal. And again, that'll give us enough runway to make it through the elections and then kind of into next year. So really would be helpful if you or anyone is able to support us in that way. The other thing is you can join our mailing list or wait list if you're an organizer or a technologist who wants to help in other ways. We aren't at the moment, until after the elections, going to be working on the sort of foundation or nonprofit side of this, where we can get volunteers in the door, just because we're so focused on getting this out there for the midterms. But post November, it's a different story. So hop on our wait list if you're a technologist that wants to kind of help us build out that community of developers, and we would really love to have some folks to turn to when that time comes. So.
Thank you so much, Samantha, and thank you so much, everyone else, for joining us today. This recording will be available on YouTube, so stay tuned, and you can always follow along with anything that we're doing at Bluebonnet on any social media. So it's just at Bluebonnet Data. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you, Samantha.
Cheers.